All right, 1 Timothy is where we're going to be. You can see the scripture, the passage that we're going to look at tonight. If you're not, if you're catching up with what we normally do on Sunday nights, we treat this more like another class, especially to look at letters from the Bible, from the New Testament that normally go unstudied. They may be read, but they're really not studied as much as they probably should be and could be in terms of that depth. So we are going through 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and that's normally the plan. One announcement that I need in something you may be able to help with, our brother Ed Warner, as he is at home, and that's good, but he has an appointment on Tuesday, this Tuesday at 10:30, and then he'll also have an appointment on Friday the 16th, and he and Sue need a ride to the appointment. She's not sure if she can help him in and out, and she would like to go, but they need some rides. If you think that you're able to help on Tuesday, let me know. They need some help getting there. The appointment on Tuesday is at 10:30, and the one on Friday the 16th is at 1 p.m. If you think you can help, let me know and just see me afterwards. If not, we'll send an email out and we'll make sure it's taken care of. But if that's something you think you can do, I know they need help with that. Please let me know after the service. So we're 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to look at the latter half of verse 2 and go down to verse 10. Well-known passage for us. We're going to go ahead and read it. Take our time to break it open. But let's read this, and again, you'll notice how familiar it is for all of us. So Paul says to Timothy, "Teach and urge these things. If anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the teaching that accords with godliness, he is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people, who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means to great gain. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Very well-known passage for us. So let's break this open as we continue to work through this. So remember, we talked about bondservants the last two Sunday nights. We've obviously examined the letter. So in a miniature conclusion in this last chapter, Paul tells Timothy to teach these things, to urge these things. And again, you probably noticed my format in doing things. When you read through letters, when you read through your New Testament, and you should, and you read through it multiple times, and you should, go ahead and get into that practice. One of the benefits is that you notice words and phrases that appear a lot. And as we've read this, you've noticed the phrase, "these things," appear a lot, and we pointed it out. But they also go along with teach and urge. That phrase, teach and urge, has been mentioned at least 3 times throughout this letter. Paul will give a big block of instruction, and then he'll tell Timothy, take that and teach and urge. Why is there need to be a sense of urgency for Timothy? Why does there need to be a sense of urgency? In other words, I want you to teach it, but I don't want you to just simply teach it for information's sake. There needs to be a sense of urgency. There needs to be something of a hastening, if you will, from you when you teach these things. So why does Timothy need a sense of urgency when it comes to teaching these things? Adam?
First of all, because of the situation they find at Ephesus, it is false teaching. It's a number of different things, and these things have to be addressed and dealt with severely. So you need to teach truth, Timothy.
All right, so considering the context, considering what's happening in the church at Ephesus, considering people, whoever they are, we've only got a few names, they haven't been named a lot, but whatever it is that they're doing, whatever it is that they're teaching, it's causing a swerving, a shipwreck of the faith of so many. There needs to be an urgency to correct that. There needs to be an urgency to get the church back on sound or healthy footing, if you will. All right, what else?
They're living in the reality of the moment. He's addressing the problems they already have, but also for the future of those masters and servants.
Okay, all right. Just like anybody else, just like any of us, we live in the moment. We live where our feet are, and that's good. You got to be where your feet are. That's not a bad thing for your mind. How do I keep my mind from wandering? I am where my feet are. At the same time, you got to be able to look down the line. You got to be able to look down the road. You got to be able to see that there is a future here in this life, but then also the same. So if things are not met head on, if healthy teaching is not brought back into the church, what happens to her? Okay, so you're going to fall apart. It'll be a Laodicea, right? And Laodicea shows us what does it look like when a church like Ephesus, for instance, loses her first love. It's a slow progression. And it ends up with Laodicea being the only church that Jesus is on the outside, not on the inside. So this sense of urgency, you're moving away. And if you don't course correct, again, you're going to get further and further away.
The urgency, that urgency is the same urgency that he addressed in the Galatian churches. It has the same kind of context of people coming and teaching things they should not be teaching. Mm-hmm. And to such a degree that they are affecting the doctrine of the gospel.
Yep, they are. They are, and they are warping it, and it's shipwrecking some. So we're now not just looking in the temporal, in the sense of earth. The souls are at stake for eternity now. And there needs to be a sense of urgency because there's got to be where those souls come back, if you will. I pressed the button too early, so ignore that bullet point for a moment. How can we manufacture some urgency? Because let's be honest. There aren't many of us right now who are living in a sense of urgency. If we are, it's work-related or it's family-related. How can we, and the Bible impresses on us, that there should be a sense of urgency for all of us because who is coming back? And he can come back at... So you got to be ready, right? There needs to be a sense of urgency. But again, we don't have it. So how can we develop it then? How can we get to the point, let's broaden it for a moment. How can you and we get to the point where we can take the same urgency that we have when it comes to work and the same urgency we have when it comes to family needs, and all of those are important. This isn't a right or wrong, okay? I just want to take the same mentality and actions that we undertake when it comes to work and when it comes to family needs and something else. You know what I'm talking about. You got a sense of urgency. How can we take that and apply it to our spiritual life so that we are under a sense of urgency to get out and to work for God? What can we do? Because I know we're not. And it's just a struggle. Now, I'm not saying go so far away that today doesn't matter. But it's a radical life change if I know that Jesus can come as a thief in the night. So you're raising your hand, Gary.
Well, I can't help but think of another couple of words. We're talking about urgency.
Yes.
How about priority?
Okay, that's a good word.
So, and you said, and I'm only repeating what you said, not because I'm saying it's wrong, but you said it, that it's not for us. I bet if we could poll the group, priority would be pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
So normally we are urgent about our priorities. I'm getting a little lost when I get there because what we apply urgency normally to priorities, And I think we can all say that we have the right priority. Maybe I'm looking for a way out. I don't know. But maybe it's not obvious because of what, we don't know the thing that we should be doing in order to display that urgency or fulfill that urgency.
It could be. No. I mean, I think I know where you're going. So correct me if I've.
I'm not sure I know.
I do. Well, then we'll both get there together. We'll figure that one out. So I do agree with priority does feed urgency. And urgency comes in and says, okay, this I have determined, or something has determined that this thing is most important, even if I say it's most important right now. And anybody who's ever done a to-do list, there's a reason why you put your thing number one. Whether it's because it's got to be done, whether there's something at stake with it, list all sorts of reasons. But that list of priorities, like you're talking about, we've assigned a mental and a heart value to it, whatever that is. And it's been assigned to us that this thing is a need. So there's a sense of urgency when I go to work, because perhaps my boss has come in and said, I need this. Okay, well, I'll stop and this will come to the top because it's now a need. Does that make sense? Perhaps there isn't much of a need. Perhaps there isn't much of a value that we have assigned. Even though the Scripture has, we have not assigned in our heart and our mind. He can come back at any moment. The sound teaching, in this case, Adam's point, the gospel is the sound teaching. It's not that it's not important. It's just that right now, there are some other things that require my attention. And what's fascinating is when Paul tells Timothy to teach and urge these things, an apostle is telling him, this needs your utmost attention. It needs it. I'm going to eliminate options. I'm going to tell you what it needs. And by telling you, Paul tells us. Does that make sense? Now, perhaps there's another way. Adam, you're raising your hand.
In this environment, it's extremely difficult to get a sense of urgency because no one seems to feel that they have need. And I use an example of a person who had that same urgency is Daniel. Mm-hmm. When Daniel said, it's been 70 years, Lord, and he earnestly prayed to find out why God hadn't restored Israel back.
Yeah. Daniel does have it. Jesus has it. In John 9, before he gets into the discussion about the man born blind, he goes about and the disciples ask him and he just simply says, we got to work while it's day because the night's coming. And he uses an image to say, we got life now, not later. Life is now. The time to live for God, the time to make decisions for God, the time to do all the things for God is now, not later. And it may be where we are in a false sense. I just take for granted that tomorrow is going to come. Now, I understand, but I got to prepare for tomorrow. I made my to-do list already for tomorrow. It's on my desk. It's the first thing I will look at tomorrow when I walk into the office. You probably have the same thing. But that's assuming that it will be here. That's assuming that will happen. You mentioned dream this morning. We can dream to a certain extent if there's a sense of urgency. Paul comes in and says, teach and urge. We like the phrase, let's light a fire under somebody. The fact that he's coming back, the fact that the gospel is being warped at this moment. We've looked at numerous things. That ought to be enough to light a fire under Timothy. He'll tell Timothy, fan into flame. Does that make sense? Now, maybe going a little bit further and being a little bit more loose with the text. But Paul sees this as a matter of urgency. What do I see as a matter of urgency when it comes to my life with God? What do we see as a matter of urgency when it comes to our work as a congregation? What is urgency to us? I know what urgency is to the Lord. He's coming back. What is it to us? And does our life reflect that? You mentioned that Wednesday from the principle of giving. Does it reflect that? Does my life reflect a sense of urgency? And normally the sense of urgency comes in when we're faced with the prospects of eternity right around the corner. That's what happens. So, verse 3. So Adam mentioned one of these already. What are the two healthy teachings according to verse 3? Because that word sound doesn't mean just the correct thing. It first and foremost means the healthy thing. That's what the word sound is. Sound, I, Elisha Freeman, of sound mind and sound body. Healthy mind, healthy body. I speak for myself. That's what the word sound is. What are the two healthy teachings, according to Paul in verse 3, that Timothy needs to urge and that Timothy needs to teach? The words of Jesus. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? So go a little bit further, since you get the answer to that one. What do you think he means with that? What's he impressing upon him when he says the words of Jesus?
Well, I just think he is working towards remembering as they are led to remember the teachings of Jesus, both the active teachings and the parables and what he did. I think that's the core, that's the gospel.
Yep.
Don't get far from it. Paul could have mentioned a lot of other things, being a Pharisee, knowing the Old Testament so well, etc., and he's not going to discount that, but he's going to focus here on, remember, the words of Jesus.
Yeah, the words of Jesus could also be the words about him. So it's the words that come from him, and also the words about him. And the first healthy teaching is the gospel. Paul 4 times, and there was intentional on this as we've gone through this study. 4 times Paul gives 4 different definitions of the gospel. There's a reason for that, because the church is moving away from it according to the different teaching of the false teachers. I asked it before, I ask it again. If the church forgets the gospel, what's lost? Everything. Everything. Not just them, but everything. Because at the end of the day, the church always has a message. But if it doesn't start with the gospel and end with the gospel, what does she have? Nothing. What's the second healthy teaching? Conforming to godliness. There's our word again. So if you've been keeping up with it, the last time we saw the word godliness was at the end of chapter 3. Paul's gone almost 2 chapters without mentioning this word. Now he picks it back up. Why? Out of all the places and out of all the times, out of all the topics, out of everything that he could have chosen, the Spirit could have chosen, why now does he, I put it to the side, I think it's now time to pick it back up and put it under the microscope. Why godliness now?
We're going a little further in the text. He talks about what's not godliness in pursuing material wealth and appearance and self-satisfying self.
Okay. All right. So he does define what it's not. It's not self-oriented because everything that comes from there, all the lists that he gives, is a form of selfishness or comes from a person who's placed themselves at the center of it. Harry?
I think, too, that because it's wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then I think this affirms that according to godliness, that the words of Christ are godly words. This is authoritative.
Okay. All right. So they are in conjunction. The words of Jesus lead to godliness. They are together. They're not separate. They're not 2 separate things, even though we may be treating them that way. So his words, whether they are him speaking or they're words about him, either way, they're godly.
He spends half a chapter on the instructions for selecting leadership.
Okay.
And they had problems with that.
They did.
So he's trying to get them educated to what they need.
Okay. Yeah. So you're right. So what got them into trouble at some point between Acts 20 and now Was the selection or the current set of leaders, shepherds, elders went off the rail? Whatever it was, something happened. So let's see if we can yes, be educated and have the information and make the right decision. Go ahead.
Just some thoughts that are accumulating. You know, we talked about how Timothy's a young man.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about how he had pretty much of an uphill battle. We talked about how he had to straighten out some elders, and that's hard for a young man.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in here in a group of people, and now we've also got false teaching, or appearance that we do.
We do, yeah.
I can see urgency. I can see urgency there
Mm-hmm.
for them under those circumstances. And so if I get to looking for urgency for myself, maybe I need to look in similar places, but it's not as obvious to me. I'm
True.
admitting that. It's not as obvious to me there as it is with Timothy and what he's trying to take on.
Sure. No, that's a good point. And I wonder if Paul is, and I don't know this is just an assumption. I wonder if Paul just left Timothy there. So Timothy's kind of brand new. He's not privy to everything that's happening under the surface. And he's bringing it to light. And he's doing that. But I love your idea, though. I'm taking this. I wonder where I see some of this happening. Do I see it externally? Can I see it internally? What am I seeing and where am I seeing it? In other words, do I have the eyes on, to see that? Here's the other thing of why godliness is brought up here, and this is what's going to directly follow. Godliness is defined as behavior, right? Godly behavior. It's usually what we think. According to the following verses, within verses 4 and 5, what are the qualities of the teachers, and what are they producing through their qualities, their behaviors, if you will? What are some of the qualities of the false teachers, and what are some of the things being produced by their actions, their behavior, if you will?
Envy, strife, abusive language, and evil suspicion.
Right, okay. Those are the results. Those are things being produced. What are their qualities? Arrogant. You have, what'd you say, Michelle?
Unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels. Unhealthy
interest. That's interesting because mine gives an unhealthy craving. Like they actually are being moved so much, the word craving. I can wrap my mind around craving because you go through the house and you're trying to figure out something to eat and it's not anything you're trying. And then you finally figure out what you're craving. But that's an interesting craving, or two words with that.
NASB has a morbid interest.
Morbid interest, interesting.
Controversial questions and disputes about words.
Okay. So what does that tell you about these individuals? If all of these, from arrogance to morbid interest, which is interesting, cravings, all of these things, what does that tell you about them?
They have a depraved mind, and they're deprived of the truth.
Okay. Gary, you were mentioning, I don't know where to look. I wonder if I can find those qualities around us. Not in terms of in us, but when I walk out these doors, can I find that? Can I find people who have morbid interest? Now I find people who love to argue and bicker and fight, but never really come to a conclusion? Can I find people who have an unhealthy craving for things? Tom mentioned this. Can I find people who operate and live their life based on arrogance? We probably work with some people like that. We probably, go places with people. Yes, ma'am. Entitlement. You're entitled. It's a good point on that. There's so many things that come with this. Paul is telling Timothy, you need to focus on these two things, because if you don't, you can get swept up in this. You can start participating in the unhealthy craving. You can start participating in the quarreling and the arguing and the fighting. You can start participating in these things, and when you do, what Adam read for us, here's what's produced. Here's the fruit: envy, dissension, arguments, endless discussions. You ever turn on the news and figure, why are we still talking about this 2 months later? Other than to keep us coming back. Do we not have an unhealthy craving for things going on in our country? Probably because we crave the eyeballs that would watch it. So why are we filling ourselves with it? Why are we allowing it to have a place Why are we actively participating that ends up in something that produces, just again, this list that he gives, and I know Adam read it, but just look at this, which produce, this is the end of verse 4, envy, dissensions, slander, evil suspicions, constant friction. Does that not describe what's going on around us now? Does that not describe people who've been swept up in things? Constant friction? I know you could, that's just take that phrase, and that describes us right now as a society. Evil suspicions? We don't know who to trust in our society anymore. Yeah. No, and that's where we're going to bring that what he says, what ultimately happens is that they figured out godliness, but godliness was a means to the gain. So even then, not only does he say this is not what it is, unhealthy craving and such, but it's also not a means to anything. It's not a means to gain. It's not a means for me to get wealthy. And make no mistake, we're not talking about time and other things. This is the proper view of material goods. As this discussion involves into this, it's a proper view of what material goods are and riches are. Go ahead, Jeff.
One of those attributes, they all circle around self-gratification, selfishness, wanting gain, doing things that make me feel good, listening to how other people's gossip, and just getting a kick out of that, it's driving you for whatever reason, but it's all about selfishness.
It is. Self is ultimately doing this, and the sound words of Jesus are selfless. Think about that for a moment. He lived selflessly. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
Well, according to Strong's, there in the original language, the idea of godliness is piety, which characterized by a Godward attitude does that well-pleasing to God. So, like this gentleman was just saying, they're making it about self, what they can get out of it, which is literally the exact opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be looking, the direction they're supposed to be going.
Correct. And Timothy needs to be opposite. But then not just Timothy, the church needs to be opposite. The church needs to be opposite. Are we opposite? You know how we maintain our opposite direction? The sound words of Jesus. Teach and urge these things. The gospel serves as a guardrail for the church to not be swept up in these things that cause dissension and fights, constant friction, evil suspicions, and yet it can happen to churches. And we have to be aware of this. So, go ahead, Ms. Doris.
Wandering mind, just was thinking about this. I know the process we go through to choose our elders, and it's a very careful process.
Sure.
Looking back, did this church choose those elders? And if so, were they choosing the elders who would kind of feed them what they wanted to hear? So that's...
We'll put, Bill, I know we've talked about it. I think we're assuming these are the ones from Acts 20, but I can't remember with what we've listened to and what we've talked. Is that the safe assumption to make here? Or is this a brand new set?
No, that's who he's talking about. He's talking about the ones that he predicted, prophesied would lead others away. That's what's happening here.
But it's the same group that he...
Yes, and the word is heteros, which means something of a different kind.
Right.
It's not anything to do with the gospel. It is a completely different message.
It is a completely, yes, it's a completely different, it's apples and oranges.
That's right.
If you will, from that image. So we're assuming this is the same eldership from Acts 20. That's the assumption. It could be some new ones added in. We're not privy to that. But whoever they are, it's coming from there, and they are teaching an orange gospel as opposed to the apple that was supposed to be there, if that makes sense. But in that, the question is why are they doing it? Because they have determined that godliness is a means to gain. And that gain is not power. That gain is not prestige. That gain is money. Because that's the discussion moving forward. That godliness is a means to gain. And the gospel, once the gospel is used to get somebody something other than a soul, it is not the gospel. If the gospel is to get power, it's not the gospel. If it's to get prestige, it's not the gospel. If it's to lord over somebody and to hammer somebody home that is a brother or sister and hold them hostage, that's not the gospel. The moment it changes, it stops being what was intended. Yep, go ahead.
To some degree, there is some defending the healthy gospel.
Yes.
And that's where the disputings, and that's where all of this, he is describing here what's going on in this congregation.
He is.
And Timothy, and providing him with an answer how to dispute it, how to stop it.
And part of that answer is here's the definition of the Gospels, of the gospel. Here's what it is. And now, like if you didn't hear what what said, that Paul is providing Timothy a blueprint on how to respond to when something different arises. Then how do we respond to someone who is twisting the gospel to selfishly gain riches? Because again, we're not talking about power and prestige, even though that's there. This next section is all about money. It's all about money. Go ahead.
I want to ask a question, not just of yourself, but maybe the class. It seems like, to me, that when we read 3 and 4, he talks about anyone who does not agree with the sound words of Jesus Christ and teaches according to God. Now, Christ, when he stood on the mount, said a lot of things.
He did.
Some of them, the Jews would immediately disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, such as love your enemies, a lot of folks might disagree with it. But it seems that Paul is addressing more than that.
He is.
That there's a background there that maybe he doesn't get into, because he immediately says that those people are puffed up and conceited and understand nothing, and has an unhealthy craving for controversy and quarrels. I couldn't deduce that from simply, at least initially, disagreeing with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So you think there's a background there?
There's a background, and the background is that I'm going to take what belongs to Jesus and I'm going to use it for me. Where Jesus would say, take what belongs to me and use it for someone else. Because he's fixing to discuss money in this chapter.
In other words, that's already happening in the congregation?
Yes. Yes. Now, most likely inspiration of the Spirit. There may have been some letters back and forth. Either way, Paul knows that one of the things that is happening from the false teachers in Ephesus is that they are preaching and teaching a godliness that ends with them receiving money. In this specific text. Now, if you go to the other chapters, there's other things that they're gaining. This isn't the only thing they're gaining. So I'm going to portray, and I'm going to believe, and I'm going to preach something that ultimately leads to me getting wealthy. Or us getting wealthy. And to agree with the sound words of our Jesus is that the gospel was never designed for anybody to get monetarily wealthy. Now, we're going to talk about there's nothing wrong with desiring riches in that regard, right? There's nothing wrong with that. We're going to discuss that. But if my way of getting wealthy in the church is to take this and to tell you to give more and more and more so I'm the one that benefits, that's not the gospel. And yeah, we see a lot of people doing this to get jets, to get mansions, and to get other things. So from the agreement standpoint, They don't agree with the core of the gospel that it is selfless or others-centered. You mentioned that Wednesday. If it's not other people-centered, that's not the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so it's in total, not when he says the words, talking about, my word now, the philosophy of Christianity, the whole.
You can bloom it out from there, but the starting place contextually is the gospel. And then you go from there. The other thing is just from a time frame, they've had plenty of time to know what Jesus stands for. And to a certain extent, church, when we were baptized, we signed on the dotted line like Israel did. All that he has said, we will do. Israel said that 3 times at the base of Mount Sinai. When we were baptized, we said all that he said, we will do. But he never said, take what I've got and turn it to monetary gain. Adam?
Ephesus, the culture, monetary gain. We're talking about these elders and whoever else is involved. They're coming out of that culture where monetary gain is what they got from selling the statues of Artemis,
Yes.
Diana. So they're mixing those two cultures together, meaning it is of godliness being of great gain. And so that's what's being rooted there. That's what Paul has happened to address. Dealing with the fact that you're moving back into paganism and think that you've been mixed the gospel, their gospel, with the Lord's gospel.
Yep.
And that's the danger that they're having in Ephesus.
It is. And anytime it's money-oriented, again, it's not the gospel. That becomes something different like Bill gave us. So I'm going to leave you with this because we ran out of time tonight. I'm going to leave you with the three last bullet points. Number 1, I want you to define contentment because this is the barrier. Here's how we respond. How does Timothy, a minister, ensure that he doesn't follow the path that they did? And then, of course, the church, too. How do we keep money in its right place? How do we keep it in its proper place? Well, contentment is going to be the word that's used. Define that for me. We're going to talk about this next week, Lord willing. What does it mean to be content? Define that. Because contentment with godliness is the gain. It's interesting. So we'll see that. But I want you to define that. Number 2, in verses 7 and 8, what 2 realities help us to be content? These are easy. These are softballs. I know you want to answer them right now. I want you to answer them at home. Because here's what I want you to do. When you answer these, food and clothing, go look in your refrigerator and go look in your closet and ask if you're content. Because he says, with these we will be. Take the definition. Then look at those words. And then I immediately want you to go to your refrigerator, go to your closet. Because those are the 2 images that he gives. Now, I know we look at it and say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. No, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with putting a roof over your head. There's nothing wrong with driving a car. These are all things that we need. There's nothing wrong when you get a hole in your shirt to go get a new shirt. We're not defining that. The point of contentment is to make sure, I'm going to use our modern day, to keep money in its lane. And this is all about money. This isn't time. This isn't anything. This is money. And these are material things. What 2 realities do that? And then, for all of us math majors, I would like for us to look at the equation. Godliness plus contentment equals gain. I'd like for you to break down that equation and then tell me what you learn. That's an interesting equation, isn't it? Godliness plus contentment equals gain. At least it's not algebra. At least you just got a plus. I'd like for you to look at those 3. How do we, in a very affluent part of the world, our country, our county, our city is very affluent. We are very affluent. How do we make sure that we keep money and material things where they need to be? That we're the ones that are driving the ship, not it. Or even more than that, Jesus Christ himself is the one that's driving this life. and moving me from the inside out. So I'd like for you to look at those three. You want to turn into a family Bible study? That's even better. But Lord willing, next week we're going to talk about these, okay? If you can help with it, Brother Ed Warner, if you think you can help on Tuesday or if you think you can help later in the month, please come up and let me know as soon as we're done. If you hadn't had a chance to partake of communion, it's been left in the hallway to my right, your left. Somebody will meet you there, and there you can partake of it together. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for Christ. Thank you for His life. Thank you for His example. He is the one that we aspire to follow. And after all, He is the one who called all of us through the good news to come follow Him and to come and die with Him. And we pray, Father,